1 Samuel chapter 8 is where we are. It is a bit of a turning point in the book of 1 Samuel, but it's also a bit of a turning point in the history of Israel. And that is because in chapter 8, Israel makes a demand for a king. Now, up until this point, what God has done is God has provided leaders for Israel. You think about leaders like Moses or leaders like Joshua. He's provided these prophets and judges, but there was no king. Now, correction, there was no human king. God had been operating in the life of Israel as their king. He was the one that was ruling. He was the one that was protecting. But something now shifts in chapter 8, which prompts these leaders of Israel to come to Samuel. That's who their current leader is. And they come to Samuel and they demand a king. I don't know if you guys ever played this game on the playground or not, but this was a real popular game for us growing up in elementary school. This maybe even is very telling as to the type of elementary school I went to. But we used to play not King of the Mountain, okay? There was, maybe you've heard that game, King of the Hill. We used to play this game called King of the Tires. And so on the playground at our school, there was a series of tires. There was a little tire. There was a slightly bigger tire, a medium-sized tire, and then right in the middle was this giant, one of those big tractor tires. And the basic gist of the game, okay, was that for the whole duration of recess, we would all try to stand on top of that giant tractor tire, okay? And whoever was standing at the top of that tractor tire at the end of recess, they were the winner. Okay, they were the king of the tires. And so we would be climbing and pushing and shoving, super safe. This game did eventually, shockingly, get shut down because of several busted heads and I believe at least one broken wrist. But you think about that, king of the tires, and come whatever may be, whether it was stitches or broken bones, someone was going to be standing on top of that tire. There was going to be a king. And this is kind of what our big idea is about and what 1 Samuel 8 is beginning to show us in our own lives is simply this. Here's the big idea. God's place is rightfully on the seat of our heart as the king of our life. That's where God belongs. His rightful place is on the seat of our heart as the king of our life. Here's what we all need to understand, and we've said this in different ways so far in this series, is that something or someone will sit on the throne of your heart. I want you to just visualize that for a second. I want you to kind of have a visual of a throne, and maybe for some of you, you've watched The Crown on Netflix, and so you got it. You see that like ornate throne. But I want you to visualize a throne that is sitting on the top of your soul. And what I want you to realize is that there is something or someone that is seated on that throne. And hopefully what that does is it begins to create a visual for us of this spiritual reality that something or someone will rule your life. Something will be in charge of. Something will be in control of your life. Whether that is God, whether that is success, whether that is money, whether that is your career, something will rule your life. And so what we have to see here in 1 Samuel 8 is that we all have to choose a king. That's a non-negotiable. Something will rule your life. And so the question becomes, will we choose the king that will either bring us life or the kings that will bring us death? Now, I know that there's someone in here, every single day, there's always someone who says, not me. Like, that's not me. Like, I'm independent. I'm not ruled by anybody. Like, I march to the beat of my own drum. Like, I am my own king. I am my own boss. Here's the reality, okay? The reality for you, if that's kind of where you would say that you land, is that your king is independence. All of us have a king. We're all ruled by something. So your independence, you're seeking independence, that is the thing that is ruling your decisions, your actions, your thoughts. All of us has to choose a king. And so what I want us to see today is that unless He is the one sitting, reigning, and ruling your heart, unless it's Him, then what is going to end up happening in your life is going to lead to disappointment, devastation, and destruction. And it will do so in subtle ways, and it will do so in not so subtle ways. So that's what I'm going to do. As we walk through here, we're going to see that Israel here, they demand a king. And in demanding a king, what I want to look at is three things. I want to look at the problem with their demand. Why is it that their demand was an issue? I want to look at the consequences that come with their demand, and then I want to look at God's grace in the midst of their demand, okay? So the problem, the consequences, and then let's look at God's grace. Look back at verse 8, or in chapter 8, verse 4. Here's what it says. Then all the elders of Israel gathered together, and they came to Samuel at Ramah. And they said to him, they said to him, behold, you are old. You know, that's like, okay, you know what? Behold, you are old, and your sons do not walk in your ways. Now appoint for us a king to judge like all the other nations. Here's the first thing that we see. This is the problem with the demand. The problem. What is the issue going on here with what these leaders are requesting of Samuel? Well, you see again the same issue. It's a different day, same problem. Just like with Eli, the priest, just like with his sons, now we see Samuel's sons. They're wicked. And the wickedness and the injustice that they are enacting, it causes the leaders to come and they say, look, we can't trust who's in charge of our nation, so therefore we are demanding a king. Now, here's what we need to understand, okay? The request itself is not wrong. The request for a king on the surface is not wrong. If you go back in the Bible to Deuteronomy chapter 17, here's what God says to the Israelites well before we get here. This is what God says in Deuteronomy 17, verse 14. When you come to the land that the Lord your God is giving you, and you possess it, and you dwell in it, and then say, I will set a king over me, like all the other nations that are around me, you may indeed set a king over you, whom the Lord your God will choose, one from among your brothers that you shall set as king over you. Here's the thing. It's not the monarchy that is bad. It's trust in the monarchy. Another way you can say that is it's not the request that's bad. It's the motives behind the request. You can think of, I'm sure every single one of us has been guilty with this, a bit guilty of this at some point in our life. But, there's always, this kind of issue that comes up when you have like this offer in your life, but the motives behind that offer are not pure. Okay, so full disclosure, I used to do this all the time to get babysitting, okay? We have 5 kids. It's expensive to get babysitting. And so what I would do, a lot of times I would do this with the university students, the young adults, is they would say, hey, I need to move this object into my dorm room or whatever. And I'd say, hey, you can use my truck. This is great. That sounded perfectly great on the surface, right? That request was perfectly, it sounded very altruistic. But there was a lot of hidden motives behind it. Because I knew next week I was going to go on a date with my wife, and I wanted that person to come over and babysit all 5 of my kids. I'm like, hey, you remember when you borrowed my truck? Yeah, I was great. I actually need you to come over tonight for the next 4 hours and watch my kids, And so guilty as charged. You know what? My request seemed good on the surface, but my motives were mixed. And so here what we see with the Israelites, the request itself is not bad, but there's motives behind it that are not pure. And here's what you begin to see. You begin to see that there are 2 ways to reject God. We talked last week about the first way to reject God. In chapter 5, we see that you can push God away. And one of the most obvious ways that you can reject God is just to get rid of him. To push him out of your life, to say that he doesn't exist, or to ignore him in your life. That's the obvious way. The not so obvious way that we see here of rejecting God is not being fully dependent upon him. That's the other way we can reject God in our life. Essentially, Israel thinks of God like a safety net. They're not altogether ready to dispose of God. They're not like, God, we want to get rid of you. No, they want him around just in case. God then becomes no better to them than their backup plan. That's who God becomes to them. So if you look in verse 19, there in chapter 8, verse 19, it says, and they said, no, there shall be a king over us, that we also may be like all the nations, that our king may judge us and go out before us and fight our battles. Think about for a second what Israel is asking of their king. Just think about it right here. They say, we want a king to judge us. We want a king for national pride. We want a king to fight our battles. Begin to think about, okay, what is it that they're asking for? They're asking for protection. They're saying, look, we want a king to protect us, to prosper us, and to fulfill us. Do you know what those are? What that is security, satisfaction, and meaning. Sound familiar? Those are the 3 things that we say all of us are after in this life. Security, satisfaction, and meaning. What Israel is saying is, they're saying we need a king to give us this. And the irony is that they already have all of this from God. They already have all of those things from God. God has promised that he would protect them. He has promised that he would prosper them. He has promised that he would provide for them. Again, you go back in the book of Deuteronomy, and this is what God says. This is his promise to the Israelites. He says this in Deuteronomy 20, verse 4, "For the Lord your God is he who goes with you to fight for you against your enemies, to give you the victory." The fact is that he has planned on giving them all of these things anyway. That's what we read in Deuteronomy 17. God's planned on giving them a king. He's planned on giving them an army, but their trust wasn't supposed to be on those things. Their trust was supposed to be in God. And so what their demand shows us here is that God is not enough. He's not enough. That they are still relying on their own strength. Now, I have not really done this a lot, but I've done it some. I've done a little bit of rock climbing, mostly going to a gym and doing some of the rock climbing at a gym. And one of the things I've learned, you have the whole system of going up and climbing and all of the ropes and all that kind of stuff. You can tell how much I've done it. I'm using all the technical terms. And so you can, obviously you have everything to climb the mountain. But then there's actually a whole nother thing involved in rock climbing, and that is rappelling, where you actually go down the mountain. And that's like a whole nother beast, okay? And so if you've ever done something like that before, not rock climbing, but rappelling, one of the things that you realize is that when you are up at the top of, whether it's the rock wall or whether you are up at the top of the cliff face, is that you have this rope that you're tied to. And what you need to do, it almost seems counterintuitive, because what you need to do is you need to lean back and trust the strength of the rope. The only way that you will successfully rappel down the mountain is if you lean back and fully trust the strength of the rope to do the work for you. Now, if you ever watch someone who can't do that, you realize that there's another way down. And that is awkward and dangerous, where they're just basically like scaling down the mountain like this, And it's a very dangerous thing to do because they're not trusting the rope. I think that gives us a visual oftentimes of what we end up trying to do in our life as it relates to God. So what we end up doing is we end up trying to scale down the mountain in our own strength, and it's awkward and dangerous. What God is saying is, no, lean back and trust the rope. That's not what Israel is doing here. They are relying on their own strength. And as a result, God sees their lack of dependence as a rejection of him. Now, this is not a new problem. In fact, here, God says that this is Israel's MO since day one. Now, this is what he says in chapter 8, verses 7 and 8. "And the Lord said to Samuel, obey the voice of the people in all that they say to you. For they have not rejected you, but they have rejected me from being king over them, according to all the deeds that they have done from the day that I brought them out of Egypt, even to this day, forsaking me and serving other gods, so that they are doing that to you." This is not a new problem. And if we're being honest with ourselves, it's not a new problem for us either. Usually we reject God, not by walking away from him, but by adding to him. So what we end up doing in our life is we don't fully outright reject God. We don't fully outright dismiss God. We just don't want to fully trust him to give us what we think we need or we want. That's the problem. And so we subtly begin to think in our life, I need God plus something else. So let me just ask you a very pointed question in your life today. Where are you doing this? Like, where has God become a fallback plan in your life? You say, I don't know. What does that look like? Let me give you a few indicators here that maybe helps you to kind of discern this in your own life that we see here from this text. The first thing that can maybe indicate if we're doing this in our lives is that we begin to make contracts with God. We begin to put stipulations on following God. We say, God, I will follow you if. What we need is, what we're saying in those moments, we kind of need like physical, tangible proof in order to trust God. I mean, think about the Israelites for a second. Just think about their situation, their relationship with God. That was supposed to give them the things that they are now demanding for in a physical king, in a human king. I think the problem is too often we want or we feel like we need something right in front of us, something tangible, whether that's money, health, success, status, even our own morality. We feel like we need those things in our life in order to make us feel secure. And so we begin to subtly make statements in our life like, God, I'll obey you if I never have to go through hardship. God, I'll obey you if you'll just make this situation easier for me. God, I'll obey you if you give me that promotion. God, I'll obey you if you can just help me pay my bills. Essentially, what we end up doing is we begin to kind of create a hostage negotiation with God. We begin to barter and make contracts. Several years ago, I read this book called Never Split the Difference. It was written by a guy who had done a ton of international hostage negotiating. He had worked primarily with the FBI. His name was Chris Voss. And so he was using all of his years and years of negotiating experience to talk about how you can negotiate with your 3-year-old. No, he was talking about workplace environments and stuff like that, but it was super fascinating. And so he's kind of sharing all these stories from his experiences of hostage negotiation. And one of the things he said is, you always see how when a hostage negotiator shows up, one of the things that they usually do is they're asking the person that's keeping the hostages to show proof that the hostages are okay. A lot of times what they'll say is, hey, I need to see the hostage. I need to see that they're okay. You know why? So he kind of unpacks like why that's the case. He says the reason that you make those demands as a hostage negotiator is because you want to maintain control. Like the reason that you ask for tangible proof that the hostages are okay is because you want to maintain control over the situation. You never want to give up control of that situation. I think that oftentimes we can do the same thing with God in our life. And what I mean by that is that we create these demands and these stipulations in order to help us maintain some sort of control over our life. So we say, God, I need to see this. I won't believe unless you show me this. I love what J.D. Greear says. He says it would be so much easier to trust God if we could just control him. And so we begin to make these contracts with God to show that we're not fully dependent upon him. Another way, though, is that our life begins to look just like all the other nations. Now, what do I mean by that? Look at verse 5. It says this, now appoint for us a king. Again, this is the leaders of Israel, and this is what they're saying. Now appoint for us a king to judge us like all the other nations. Israel looks around and they see all these nations around them and they want to be like them. The problem was that God had appointed Israel to be different than all of the other nations. You go this week and read in Deuteronomy chapter 4 and you see how God has outlined and stipulated how Israel was to be a witness to who he was because they were different than all of the other nations. So what Israel is doing here is they're forfeiting their witness. The distinction that God had clearly set out for them, that they were to be a nation that was fully and completely dependent upon him, not on some earthly king. They're forfeiting that in their life. They're forfeiting that witness, and they are essentially comparing themselves just like all of the other nations. I begin to think about that as it relates to us. I think too often our definition of success in our life can look exactly like the definition of success in the life of those around us. The only difference is we might just hang a silver cross around its neck and call it Christian. And our success looks just like the way that our culture defines success. But here's the thing, the thing that was supposed to amaze, the thing that's supposed to amaze our neighbors, the thing that's supposed to amaze our coworkers is not that we have the same things as them. Whether that's status or success or money, whatever that is, it's not that we have the same things. It's that regardless of whether we have those, gain those, lose those, that our mantra as followers of Jesus is what David says in Psalm 23:1. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. That's what's supposed to make us distinct. That regardless of what happens in our life, regardless of what it looks like, we can still say with confidence, God, you are my shepherd. You are everything that I need. And I am fully and completely dependent upon you. I have no want. And so this is the problem with the demand. The problem is not the demand itself, it's the motives behind it. The motives are showing a lack of dependence upon the Lord. But this brings us to the second thing, which is the consequences. The consequences of getting what they demanded. So Samuel gives them a warning. He says to them, look, you need to know the cost. It's kind of like if you go skiing, and right before you go down the double black diamond, you see that nice big orange warning sign. And what really gets me is they're always like pictures of someone's like neck, like, you know. And I'm like, really? Like, yeah, I could have done without the pictures. Like, I can read, that I could break my neck. I get it, But they have this sign. It's got all of these, like, warnings listed out there. And it says, like, hey, be careful. If you go down this mountain, like, this is what could happen. Got it. And this is what Samuel is doing here. He's saying, fine, you want a king? Let me be very clear to you what that's going to look like. So this is what it says. Look at verse 11. It says, these will be the ways of the king who will reign over you. He will, and here's the word, he will take your sons and appoint them to his chariots, and to be his horsemen and to run before his chariots, and he will appoint for himself commanders of thousands and commanders of 50s, and some to plow his ground and to reap his harvest, and to make his implements of war and the equipment of his chariots. He will take your daughters to be perfumers and cooks and bakers. He will take the best of your fields and vineyards and olive orchards and give them to his servants. He will take the tenth of your grain and your vineyards and give them to his officers and to his servants. He will take your male servants and female servants and the best of your young men and your donkeys and put them to his work. He will take the tenth of your flocks, and you shall be his slaves. And in that day you will cry out because of your king, whom you have chosen for yourselves. But the Lord will not answer you in that day. You see a theme coming up here? And one of the things that we said a couple weeks ago is that when we fail to listen to the voice of the Lord, when God is speaking to us and we fail to heed his words, it will lead to devastation. And that's exactly what Samuel is telling the Israelites here. You see, just these few verses in 1 Samuel chapter 8, the word take comes up 6 times. And so it shows us here in 1 Samuel 8 the nature of these kings that are not God that sit on the throne of our heart. So what does that look like? Well, a few things here. First, kings, they take, they don't give. Kings take, they don't give. And so we just said every life has a king. And a king is whatever makes you happy or secure. And the nature of these kings is that all kings make their subjects into servants. This is what Paul says in Galatians 4, verse 8. Paul brings this out. He says, formerly, when you did not know God, what does he say? You were enslaved to those that were by nature are not God's. Kings bring slavery, not freedom. When your career or that relationship or your marriage, when that is the thing that is sitting and ruling and reigning on the throne of your heart, what that brings is it does not bring freedom, it brings slavery. So let's just take like a common example, okay? Let's just take money, okay? Because most people, if you're being honest with yourself, most people think if I had a little bit more money, my life would be a little bit easier. Like if my life, if I had a couple more million, like my life would be a lot easier, People think that. In fact, I was talking to a guy at the gym the other day, and I said, yeah, man, how's your week going? He's like, it's great. The only thing would be better is if I won the lottery. And it got me thinking. You're like, I wonder if people who actually win the lottery are actually happy. And so I did a little digging this week, thinking about this sermon, and I found it was actually saddening. I found story after story after story, dozens and dozens of stories of people who won the lottery, millions and millions of dollars, and their life completely fell apart. Let me read for you 2 of these. William Bud Post. William Bud Post won $16.2 million in the Pennsylvania lottery. But he was $1 million within a year, he was $1 million in debt. He said, I wish it had never happened. It was totally a nightmare. A former girlfriend successfully sued him for a third of his winnings, and his brother was arrested for allegedly hiring a hitman to kill him, in the hopes that he'd inherit a share of his winnings. And after sinking money into family business, Post sank into debt and spent time in jail for firing a gun over his head at a bill collector. He said, I was so much happier when I was broke. He told the Washington Post, Bud lives quietly now on $450 a month and food stamps. Or he lived quietly on $450 in food stamps until he died in 2006. Here's another one. Before they won $2.76 million in 2005, Laura and Roger Griffiths of England reportedly never argued. Then they won and bought a $1 million barn, converted house, and a Porsche, not to mention luxurious trips to Dubai, Monaco, and New York City. Media stories say their fortune ended in 2010 when a freak fire gutted their house, which was underinsured, forcing them to shell out for repairs and 7 months of temporary accommodations. Shortly after, there were claims that Roger drove away in the Porsche after Laura confronted him over emails, suggested that he was interested in another woman. They ended their marriage after 14 years. We begin to think that these kings are going to bring us freedom, but the reality is all they do is take from us. They just take. John D. Rockefeller, after he had earned his millions and millions of dollars, he was famously asked, he said, "How much money is enough?" And he said, "$1 more." That's the nature of these kings. They don't give, they take. But the other thing about these kings is they always look good on the surface. They always look good at first. So if we flip over to chapter 9, look at chapter 9, verse 1. It says, "There was a man of Benjamin whose name was Kish, the son of Abiel, the son of Zeror, son of Bechorath, son of Aphiah, a Benjamite, a man of wealth, and he had a son." This is important because this figure is going to now be with us for a lot of this story. He had a son whose name was Saul. How does it describe Saul? Saul was a handsome man. There was not a man among the people of Israel more handsome than he. From his shoulders upward, he was taller than any of the other people. Here's the thing, Saul looked the part. Saul was tall, he was strong, he was handsome. He was the quintessential king. He was the kind of guy that if you thought, I wonder what a king looks like, that was Saul. He looked the part. When I was in university, we played intramural basketball, and I'm not very tall, and so I needed to find someone who could, help out with the, taller portions of basketball. And so I went to one of the guys on campus, Big Don. That's what we called him, Big Don. Big Don was 6'10". I got to know Big Don in the weight room. Man, he would just sling the weights around, and I thought, this guy, he needs to be on my team. Because he's unbelievable. He's huge. I'm like, he would just be a force on the basketball court. And so I'm really excited because I recruit Big Don to my team. And we get out there for the first game. Big Don is the most uncoordinated, unathletic person I have ever met in my life. And I couldn't believe it. He was awful, And it was just a huge disappointment. And I don't think we actually won an entire game, But it goes to show, you can look at someone and you can say, hey, I think that person right there, that's supposed to be king. And that was Saul. He had all the looks. The truth is for us, whatever it is that is our fallback plan, whatever our safety net is in our life, that will always have an initial appeal. And honestly, it will kind of seem up front like it's actually working. It will. Success, money, acceptance, marriage, children, popularity, healing, all of those things will make you feel better in the short term. But if they are the thing that are sitting on the throne of your heart, ruling your life, ultimately they will always let you down. And so they might look good up front, but they will let you down, which leads us to the last thing here, that kings, they overpromise and they underdeliver. So they always take, they look good on the surface, and they always overpromise and underdeliver. By the time you get to chapter 10, if you flip over to chapter 10, let's just see what's happening here with Saul. They're about to appoint Saul as king over Israel. And they go looking for Saul, and they can't find him. And here's what it says in chapter 10, verse 20. Then Samuel brought all the tribes of Israel near, and the tribe of Benjamin was taken by Lot. And he brought the tribe of Benjamin near by its clans. And the clan of Matretus was taken by its lot. And Saul, the son of Kish, was taken by Lot. But when they sought him, he could not be found. So they inquired again of the Lord, is there a man still to come? And the Lord said, behold, he has hidden himself among the baggage. He's hiding. Saul might look good, but as you read on into chapters 9 and into chapters 10, what you realize is that Saul is full of indecision. He's full of passivity. He's full of weakness. Overpromise and underdeliver. Chapter 10 is actually giving us, it's interesting, it's actually giving us a literary image. Because what it's saying is that the people asked for a king. They wanted an earthly king who could come and meet all of their needs. And this idea is he doesn't exist. He can't be found. Where is Saul? We can't find him. It's this literary imagery that the author is giving us to say that's because there is no earthly king that can give you what you're actually looking for. It doesn't exist. Now, I know this is going to be controversial, okay? But it makes me think a lot about this treasure over here in Oak Island, you know? Like, I know that there's a lot of theories about this as to, like, what actually exists in this treasure in Oak Island, you know? I read this week that they believe that the Ark of the Covenant might be on Oak Island. Seriously. Like, manuscripts of Shakespeare. Like, I'm like, what is not on Oak Island? Like, that's where Loch Ness Monster probably is. Like, we're just looking in the wrong place, you know? But here's my theory. I think they've been looking for hundreds of years over on Oak Island for this treasure. What if it doesn't exist? You know? And you're spending all this money and putting all this effort into something that maybe it doesn't even exist. And here are the Israelites. The Israelites are searching for something, and God is showing them it doesn't exist. You're looking for a king to save you. I'm the one who saves you. So the Israelites, they want a human king to save them, and that king is going to overpromise, but he is going to continually under-deliver. And that is true for any of the kings that we have set up in our life. Listen, I know that there are some of you in here this morning that you are experiencing that right now. That you have looked to certain things in your life that you thought would be the answer. Maybe it was your marriage. Maybe it's in your career. Maybe it is with a certain relationship. Maybe it's a result of a pay raise you got, and you thought that was the ticket. You thought that was the thing that was going to give you a sense of control and meaning and purpose in your life. But unfortunately, you're here and you're like, it's not. That feeling of being let down, of being disappointed, of the undelivered, that is ringing true in your heart this morning. So the question then becomes, okay, what do we do? Like, what do we do if we have set something up in our life that is not God? It brings us to the last thing, and we'll close with this. The last thing is this: even amidst these consequences, even amidst their sinful demand, God's grace is still at work. So what I want to look at here as we close is the grace of God in the midst of their demand. Just ask yourself, why is it that God actually gives them what they want? You ever think about that? Why is that? If you look in chapter 9, verse 16, we begin to see the answer. That God's grace is at work even in the midst of this sinful demand. Here's what it says in chapter 9, verse 16. Tomorrow, about this time, God says, I will send to you a man from the land of Benjamin. He's telling this to Samuel. And you shall anoint him to be prince over my people, Israel. And listen, he shall save my people from the hand of the Philistines. For I have seen my people because their cry has come to me. Let's think about this for a second. Even though God's people have rejected him as king, God has still not rejected his people. God in his grace is going to still give them a king, albeit an imperfect one. But it was through experiencing the imperfection of this human king that I think ultimately would drive the Israelites, ultimately would drive us to realize and to see our need for a more perfect king. So in God's grace, he gives them what they want in order for them to understand that what they want is not actually what they need. I think sometimes in our life, God lets you experience the things that you are asking for in order to, in his goodness and in his kindness, to help you to see that you are asking for the wrong thing. I don't know if you've ever had something in your life that you're like, man, I need this thing. And you're like staked your happiness on it. And you're like, if I get this, like it's going to make my life better, okay? That was a whippersnapper for me several years ago, okay? I was like, man, I need a really good whippersnapper because this yard work is getting really frustrating. And so I was like super pumped, saved up some money, went and got like a legit whippersnapper. And you know what? I don't know about you, but every whippersnapper I've ever owned, like they just don't work. They just don't. These little carburetors, like they're just terrible. And so here I am, like a week later, out in the middle of my yard. I'm that guy, like, straining to pull this cord for like 30 minutes until finally I gave up and just heaved the thing across the cul-de-sac, you know? Like, I was convinced that, like, once I had this thing in my life, like, it was going to make it better, and it only made it more frustrating. There are things in our life that we're asking God for, and we think, man, if I get this, it will make it so much better. And yet God gives it to us in His grace to show us, no, it won't. Because if you don't have me, it doesn't matter what you have. And so sometimes in His grace, God lets you experience what you're asking for to show you that it's the wrong request. But His grace also works in other ways too, in regards to our asking, because sometimes in His graciousness, what God does is sometimes He doesn't answer your prayer. And it's not because God is indifferent, it's because of His kindness. Because He knows what you actually need. You can say it this way, His refusal, it might not be indifference, it might be His kindness. You ever think about that? Sometimes God's unanswered prayer in your life, it actually might be His kindness to you. I don't know what that is. I don't know what that looks like. But what God is doing is He's showing you that your need is ultimately for Him. Now, eventually, there would be a day coming when God would give Israel not the king that they wanted, but the king that they actually needed. I mean, you think about this. You see Israel's demand for a king, a demand for a king who would, ultimately this king would oppress them. And we're going to see later on, whether it's Saul or whether it's David, because of the sin of the king, you're going to see many people lose their life. So this king comes in and he oppresses his people, and as a result of his sin, people die. But eventually, God was going to give Israel a king. He was going to give us another king. And that king is Jesus. Jesus is the true king who doesn't bring oppression. Jesus is the one who actually brings us freedom. And the truth is that because of our sin, Jesus died. The king of the Israelites, because of his sin, the people died. Because of our sin, the people, Jesus died. That's the true king that God gives us. The king that we ultimately need. The one who, on our behalf, went to the cross and paid the penalty for our sin so that we could have right standing with God. Jesus is the true king who brings us freedom. He's the king that says in Mark 10, the one that came not to be served, but to serve. To give his life as a ransom for many. I love what Tim Keller says. He says, Jesus is the only king that if you obtain him, he will satisfy you. He's also the one, if you fail him, he will forgive you. That's different than any other king that is ruling your life. Because every other king says, obey me and I will guarantee you happiness. Money, success, marriage, family. When they become what rules your heart, all of them say, look, find me and I will make you happy. But then what they do is they turn around and they say, but if you disappoint me, I will make you miserable. If you fail me, you will never have the good life. If you let me down, you will be lonely and discontent for your whole life. They promise you everything. They bring you nothing. Let me close with one of our modern day philosophers, Bob Dylan. Bob Dylan, he got it right when he said this. He sang it in a song, Gotta Serve Somebody. And here's what Bob Dylan says in this song. He says, you may be an ambassador to England or France. You maybe like to gamble. You maybe like to dance. You maybe like the heavyweight champion of the world. You might be a socialite with a long string of pearls, but you're going to have to serve somebody. Yes, indeed. You're going to have to serve somebody. Well, it may be the devil or it may be the Lord, but you are going to have to serve somebody. Jesus is the only king that if you obey him, he will truly satisfy you. But he's also the only king that if you let him down, he will forgive you. Let's pray. Father, thank you so much for this truth. And Father, I ask that your Holy Spirit would help us to see in our life, God, the things that we have set up in opposition to you. And God, would we turn from them? And Father, would we again say, Jesus, you are the true King. And Father, we invite you to rule and to reign in our life. God, I pray for those that would be here that, God, have never made that declaration. God, would there be some today who would say for the first time, Jesus, I want you to be Lord of my life. I want you to be in full control. I fully surrender to you. God, I pray that you would work in that way. And we ask this in Jesus' name.